Hey guys, tonight we're taking you inside a world so magnificently foul and unhygienic, you'll wonder how anyone called it passion, let alone a profession. We're not talking about perfumed harems or lotus-scented romance painted on Egyptian walls. No, tonight's story is about what Egyptian prostitute hygiene was really like. So before you get cozy, I'd really appreciate a quick like or even a subscribe. It helps way more than you know. And hey, I'm always curious where you're tuning in from. Drop a comment with your city and what time it is for you. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your bed is not a bed. It's a splintering wooden bench covered in reeds that feel like knives pressed against your back. The linens are a dark, stiff cloth that hasn't been washed since some pharaoh was still alive. You shift and realise the pillow is just a folded tunic that smells like beer, onions and desperation. A rat scuttles across the floor, dragging what you hope is bread. And the air. Oh, the air is an orchestra of rot. A sour blend of sweat, spilled wine, old smoke, and a perfume that smells suspiciously like melted goat. Because here's the first unpleasant truth. Prostitutes in ancient Egypt often covered themselves in animal fat mixed with herbs and resins. It was perfume in name only. Under the flickering lamp you can see it dripping in oily trails, clinging to the skin like rancid butter. The hotter the night, the stronger the stench. Romantic if you're turned on by a butcher shop. You sit up and realise your mouth feels dry, salty, like you've been chewing sand, which in a way you have. Prostitutes chewed on natron, the same mineral priests packed into mummies to dry out their bodies. In theory it was mouthwash. In practice it left your tongue parched and your breath tasting like a funeral home. Imagine leaning in for a kiss only to get a whiff of embalming powder. That's the ancient Egyptian version of freshening up. But it gets worse. Because contraception here was a nightmare science experiment. Crocodile dung, honey, and sour milk. All crammed inside the body as a barrier. The result was sticky, foul-smelling, and about as medically sound as stuffing a swamp into your underwear. Did it prevent pregnancy? Sometimes. Did it guarantee infection? Almost always. And you're not alone in this stink. The tavern around you is heaving with sailors, labourers, and men already glazed in sweat. They shout over the clatter of pottery jars and the drone of flutes. The air is so thick with flies you can hear the buzzing louder than the music. Somewhere in the corner someone coughs. Wet, deep, and alarming. And you suddenly remember that venereal disease wasn't just a risk. It was practically the house special. Medical papyri from the time-mentioned treatments involving honey, beer, and crushed insects. A cure so dubious it makes the crocodile dung almost look sophisticated. Your skin itches. Maybe from the straw, maybe from the lice, maybe from the fact that your blanket probably belonged to 3 people before you. Egypt prided itself on being a land of ritual cleanliness. People shaved their bodies, wore fresh linen, bathed in the Nile. Yet here you are, stuck in the one corner of society where the rules didn't apply, where perfume smelled like decay, mouthwash tasted like a crypt, and birth control doubled as pest control. The contradictions are almost as suffocating as the smell. You can feel the grease clinging to your skin, the salt burning your lips, the air buzzing with flies and incense. And just when you think it cannot possibly get worse, a jar tips over nearby. Beer, sweat, and something unidentifiable soak into the floor, turning it into a swamp beneath your bare feet. Welcome to your night in an Egyptian brothel. Survival isn't about seduction here. It's about enduring the grease, the salt, the dung, and the disease long enough to crawl back out into the Nile air. But don't relax yet. Because if you thought the tavern brothel was disgusting, just wait until you step into the city streets at dawn, where the illusion of Egyptian cleanliness peels away like rotting papyrus. The smell of the tavern clings to you like a second skin, but the true misery begins once you notice what is on everyone's head. Wigs, ornaments, and hairpieces, each one carefully shaped and styled to suggest beauty, but in reality they are swarming with lice. Prostitutes often wore elaborate wigs made from human hair, or, if you were unlucky enough to afford a cheaper version, animal hair mixed with plant fibres. The theory was elegance, but the reality was a portable insect colony sitting directly above your face. In a culture obsessed with appearance, hair was both a symbol of refinement and a breeding ground for filth. Shaving the scalp smooth was supposed to solve the problem, but the wigs put it right back again. Egyptian society adored wigs. They were perfumed with oils and sometimes powdered with scented cones that would melt in the heat, dripping fragrant grease across the body during social events. For the prostitutes working in brothels, these wigs were tools of the trade, luring clients with a manufactured glamour. But beneath the sheen of oil and the weight of beeswax held together with pins, the itch was constant. Imagine leaning close to whisper, only to have a louse crawl across your forehead, bold enough to join in the conversation. The very wigs meant to seduce were crawling with the proof of just how unhygienic this world truly was. What makes it more bizarre is how Egypt managed this contradiction. On one hand, barbers existed who would shave heads and even armpits as a regular service. On the other, prostitutes clung to wigs that transformed their scalps into living terrariums. And it was not just lice. Fleas, nits, and sometimes mould grew in the wax and sweat that glued the wigs together. In a land where the sun baked everything, wigs became little ovens of rot and infestation. All of this carefully perfumed with lotus oil, which only barely concealed the stink of decay. You shift your eyes from the wigs to the jewellery, and the story does not improve. Prostitutes often wore cheap trinkets designed to mimic the gold and turquoise ornaments of wealthier women. These ornaments, pressed against sweat and grease, left green stains on the skin, adding a metallic tang to the already overwhelming aroma. Archaeologists have found small cosmetic cases filled with coal and malachite, both applied around the eyes for allure. But mixed with sweat, coal had a habit of dripping like black sludge, streaking faces into grotesque masks under the oil lamps of the taverns. The very cosmetics of seduction doubled as grotesque reminders that beauty in this trade was always one bead of sweat away from horror. Cosmetics themselves tell their own story of filth. Coal was ground from galena, a mineral laced with lead. Day after day, prostitutes smeared it around their eyes not just for allure, but with the belief that it protected against disease and the sun's glare. The irony is sharp, since prolonged exposure to lead could poison the very women who depended on it for survival. The powder that promised to ward off infection slowly eroded their health, a slow collapse hidden beneath painted eyelids. Honey was added sometimes as a binder, creating a sticky sludge that attracted flies. Imagine stepping into a brothel lit by oil lamps, the air buzzing with insects, only to watch them cling to sticky eyelashes glistening with lead paste. This is where the hypocrisy of Egyptian cleanliness becomes clear again. Bathing was ritual, shaving was routine, and cosmetics were considered protective. Yet prostitutes lived inside a contradiction where these practices created more filth than they removed. Perfumes melted, wigs festered, cosmetics poisoned, and jewellery corroded. Even the simple act of sweat turned everything into a swamp of odours and infections. What was supposed to be beauty became grotesque performance art, a living illusion of refinement hiding endless layers of grime. The sensory overload inside one of these brothels must have been unforgettable. Oily perfumes dripping from cones, coal smeared into rivers across cheeks, wigs crawling with lice, and breath seasoned with natron. The sights and smells told the truth that temple murals never dared carve in stone. Prostitutes were not radiant priestesses of seduction, but labourers in a trade where filth was unavoidable, and often deliberately applied in the name of beauty. This was a profession where appearances mattered more than comfort, and survival required enduring an environment that was actively hostile to the body itself. It would be easy to assume these were isolated horrors, confined to a few unlucky women. But the papyri suggest otherwise. The medical texts of Egypt mention eye infections and treatments for what we now know as sexually transmitted diseases. Some remedies involve pouring sour milk into the eyes, others applying honey to infected areas. These cures, laughable by modern standards, highlight just how common these ailments were. The brothel was not only a site of commerce but a hub of illness, the very tools of seduction doubling as carriers of disease. And so you stand in this stinking, buzzing tavern, surrounded by greasy wigs, dripping coal, and the endless drone of insects. Every blink brings the sting of smoke and sweat. Every breath tastes like metal and rot. The illusion of beauty collapses under the weight of lice and lead. This is no fantasy of painted walls and perfumed harems. This is what seduction smelled like when survival was measured in coins, not in comfort. And yet, the night is far from over. Because as miserable as the wigs and cosmetics were, what really revealed the filth of this trade was not the head or the face at all, but what happened beneath the linen, where another layer of history's most revolting practices was waiting. The wigs and coal may already be making your skin crawl, but the real nightmare begins when you notice the linens and clothing wrapped around these bodies. Ancient Egyptian prostitutes often wore sheer linen dresses, the kind that left little to the imagination. But the idea of delicately laundered fabric is a modern fantasy. Linen was difficult to keep clean, it absorbed sweat instantly, and in the heat of a crowded brothel, it transformed into a sponge for every odour in the room. Archaeological finds show linen often yellowed and stiffened with oils, and in the brothel setting this meant each garment carried the smells of a dozen encounters, baked in under the relentless desert sun. Egyptian linen was woven fine, sometimes so fine it was translucent, but maintaining its cleanliness was a losing battle. Washing meant beating the fabric against stones by the river, or scrubbing with natron, the same salty mineral used for mummies and mouthwash. That method stripped fabric thin over time, leaving it brittle and prone to tearing. Prostitutes needed their garments to suggest allure, not practicality, so many simply dabbed oils and perfumes onto the fabric to disguise the filth. The result was a slick, rancid layer that clung to the body and left stains across the benches and bedding. It was the ancient equivalent of spraying deodorant over a week-old shirt and pretending no one would notice. Linen was also expensive, which meant many prostitutes reused the same outfits long past their lifespan. Archaeological depictions often show women in tight-fitting, pleated dresses, but the reality was closer to garments stiff with sweat, patched with whatever fabric scraps were available, and reeking of the last night's customers. When linen became too worn, some resorted to rougher weaves or blends of hemp, each one less comfortable and more abrasive in the heat. Imagine the itch of sweat-soaked fabric rubbed against skin already raw from oil, perfume and constant use. The glamour of painted tomb scenes collapses instantly when you realise the reality was a wardrobe that smelled like the Nile at low tide. What made this worse was that laundering itself was unhygienic. Washermen stood knee-deep in the river, scrubbing garments with natron and urine, because fermented urine was a common cleaning agent. Yes, urine. Its ammonia content made it useful, but the smell never fully left. Prostitutes often ended up wearing clothing that carried both the stench of sweat and the lingering tang of fermented waste. The contradiction of Egyptian society appears again here, where ritual cleanliness existed alongside the casual use of bodily fluids as soap. Your own skin would become the final filter, absorbing everything the fabric carried. The bedding was no better. Taverns and brothels provided reed mats, straw pallets, or simple wooden benches draped with cloth. None of it was washed regularly. Reed mats harboured insects, straw bred lice and fleas, and wooden benches were slick with oils and residues. Archaeological evidence suggests fleas were a constant nuisance, and references in medical papyri describe treatments for itching and sores. The cure often involved rubbing animal fat mixed with herbs onto the skin, essentially adding another layer of grease to the problem. The brothel bed was not a place of comfort, but a petri dish, a place where every encounter added to a growing ecosystem of pests and smells. The religious angle adds another twist. Prostitutes sometimes performed fertility rituals or invoked deities like Hathor, goddess of love and music. This meant their beds were often decorated with amulets or charms, sometimes carved from faience or ivory. But beneath the symbolism, the practical conditions never changed. Religious symbols may have suggested divine protection, but the fleas never cared. The amulet might promise fertility or allure, but the reality was constant itching, endless scratching, and the risk of infection every time skin broke beneath fingernails. It is difficult to overstate just how overwhelming the sensory mix must have been. Oil lamps smoked heavily, leaving soot clinging to fabrics. Sweat seeped through linen and pooled in creases. Perfumes of frankincense or myrrh, expensive luxuries, were rare in this trade. More often the scent was cheaper resins mixed with animal fat, dripping down stained clothing already stiff with filth. The heat of dozens of bodies packed into a single room magnified everything, baking the smells into fabric and hair alike. Stepping into one of these spaces would be like walking into a furnace that smelled of onions, goat grease, and unwashed laundry. The contradictions of Egyptian cleanliness are especially sharp here. Public baths and private washing rituals were common among the wealthy. Even modest families valued soap made from animal fats or natron scrubs. Yet prostitutes were trapped in an environment where clothing and bedding were never truly clean, only covered up with oils and resins. The illusion of allure was maintained, but the cost was an environment that constantly bred infection. Bedbugs and lice carried fevers, sores became septic, and even the cosmetics meant to hide fatigue often contained toxic minerals. The very industry of seduction corroded the body it relied on. The more you look, the clearer it becomes that this profession was sustained by illusion. Linen dresses clung to the skin not as fresh garments, but as rancid cloth baked with sweat and oils. Beds promised intimacy but delivered insects. Perfumes disguised decay rather than removing it. Every surface was layered with evidence of use, every moment of contact a gamble with health. And the irony is that this took place within a society renowned for its obsession with purity, its daily baths, its carefully shaved heads, and its endless supply of cosmetics. The brothel existed at the very edge of that obsession, both included in and excluded from the rituals of cleanliness. Your feet shuffle against the mat and you feel something crawl. The itch starts instantly, a reminder that parasites never take a night off. The air tastes heavy with salt and grease, the linen sticks against your skin, and the realization dawns that nothing here is truly clean, only repainted, rescented, and repurposed. The seduction was always for the eye, never for the nose, never for the skin. Beneath the illusion, it was rot woven into cloth, itch woven into reeds, and infection woven into every encounter. And as the lamps burn lower, your eyes catch the glint of something more unsettling. Not wigs, not linens, not perfumes, but the very food and drink these women lived on, each one laced with its own unhygienic misery that made survival even harder than the trade itself. Your eyes follow the glow of the oil lamps, but the scent of food cuts through the greasy perfumes and sweat. In the corner of the tavern brothel, clay bowls hold remnants of meals that tell their own story of unhygienic survival. Prostitutes lived on the same cheap fare as labourers and sailors, mostly bread and beer, sometimes onions or dried fish if the night was lucky. None of this food was kept with cleanliness in mind. Bread was often half spoiled before it ever reached the table, crawling with grit from sand that ground between your teeth with every bite. The Nile was generous with fish, but without proper storage it spoiled quickly, leaving meals flavoured with rot. Beer was the staple. It was thick, gritty, and full of floating husks of grain. Brewed in open jars, it carried flies and dust along with every gulp. It was safer than Nile water, which teemed with parasites, but that did not make it pleasant. Prostitutes in taverns drank constantly, not only because beer was filling, but because customers expected it. Every sip added to the smell of stale yeast that clung to breath and sweat, mixing with the rancid oils already coating the skin. The aroma of intimacy in these places was equal parts goat fat and warm beer, a combination strong enough to etch itself into memory. Onions were another staple, eaten raw or boiled, their pungent scent lingering on every exhale. Archaeological finds confirm onions were considered nourishing, even sacred, yet in a brothel the effect was less mystical and more stomach-churning. Imagine leaning close to someone whose last meal was raw onion washed down with half-spoiled beer, while their breath still carried the sting of natron mouthwash. Meals may have been fuel for survival, but they also became part of the suffocating haze that defined the brothel's atmosphere. There is also the matter of how food was stored. Bread and fish sat in baskets, exposed to flies. Beer fermented in open jars without lids. Insects swarmed freely, laying eggs in anything sweet or sticky. Honey, sometimes used as a food and sometimes as a contraceptive ingredient, attracted ants and beetles by the dozens. Prostitutes who relied on tavern kitchens lived among constant infestations, their meals shared with every crawling thing the Nile Valley could produce. And it was not just the food that bred filth. Drinking vessels and plates were rarely washed, often wiped with a rag that was already saturated with grime. One person's spit was easily another person's next mouthful. Medical texts from the period mentioned stomach complaints with depressing frequency. Remedies included honey, herbs, and sometimes ground stone or clay to settle the belly. The truth is clear. The food prostitutes consumed was a major vector for disease. Tapeworms and parasites thrived in undercooked fish. Dysentery spread easily in shared taverns. Beer was thick enough to hide contamination, but it also served as the main liquid in daily life, guaranteeing constant exposure. When combined with the exhaustion of their trade, prostitutes lived in a cycle of poor nutrition, constant illness, and overwhelming stench. What adds to the absurdity is how central food and drink were to the trade itself. Brothels were often taverns first, offering beer to lure customers in. Prostitutes were expected to sit, drink, and entertain before business began. Every encounter was marinated in yeast and onions, with greasy fingers passing from food to flesh without a pause. Hygiene never entered the equation. The very act of dining became part of the ritual of seduction, even as it spread disease and worsened the smell of every room. Archaeological evidence backs up this picture. Potsherds from tavern sites often show beer residues crusted with layers of dirt. Bones of fish and small animals are found in heaps, many charred only lightly, suggesting half-cooked meals. Papyri described tavern life as noisy, dirty, and dangerous, a place where food, drink, and sex intertwined into one inseparable business. For prostitutes working in such conditions, the diet was not only disgusting but physically punishing. Malnutrition left skin sallow, teeth worn, and bodies weakened, making the daily act of survival even more difficult. The sensory picture becomes overwhelming when you place yourself in the scene. The tang of stale beer on breath, the sharpness of onion sweat, the acrid sweetness of spoiled fish, all mixed into the oil and resin perfumes dripping from greasy wigs. Every surface was sticky, every bite gritty, every gulp alive with the buzzing of flies. Eating was not a relief from the misery of the trade, but simply another extension of it, one that brought its own dangers and humiliations, and so the contradiction sharpens again. Egypt prided itself on grain storage, on abundant harvests, on banquets depicted in tomb art where servants carried platters of roasted meats and golden loaves. But prostitutes never touched such luxury. Their meals were stale bread, spoiled fish, and sticky beer shared with flies. In a land celebrated for plenty, they lived in taverns where the food itself added to the stench and the danger. The myth of Egyptian abundance collapses quickly when viewed through the lives of those who sold intimacy for survival. You can feel the yeast souring on your tongue, the grit of sand scraping your teeth, the film of grease coating your lips. The tavern's food turns your stomach as much as it smells. Every swallow becomes part of the nightmare, and yet it was the only option. The body needed fuel, no matter how foul the source. Meals were a form of endurance, not enjoyment, but the misery did not stop at what went in the mouth. The true danger lurked in what came out of the body afterward, in the absence of sanitation that turned every alley, jar and mat into another stage for filth and disease. The beer and onions may have gone down, but now the body demands an exit, and this is where things spiral into even darker territory. Sanitation in tavern brothels was nearly non-existent. Few establishments had anything resembling a latrine, and even the wealthier ones simply relied on jars or pits that were rarely emptied. Most waste ended up tossed into alleys, ditches, or directly into the Nile. In a setting already crawling with flies, these makeshift arrangements transformed every corner into another breeding ground for disease. Archaeological evidence confirms how widespread the problem was. Excavations of worker villages and tavern sites have uncovered layers of compacted waste, mixed with broken pottery and animal bones, all crammed into courtyards and alleys. The Nile was the final dumping ground for much of it, carrying human waste downstream where others still bathed, washed clothes, and even drew drinking water. Prostitutes who lived and worked in this system were exposed constantly to parasites that thrived in contaminated water. Schistosomiasis, a disease caused by worms in stagnant water, left its mark on skeletons from the period, proving that infection was routine. In the brothel itself, jars and chamber pots were sometimes provided, but these were rarely cleaned thoroughly. Urine and feces clung to the porous clay, seeping into every crevice. Rinsing with Nile water did little, since the water was already compromised. Prostitutes used these vessels night after night, each one a miniature laboratory of bacteria and parasites. The smell was unavoidable, drifting through crowded rooms already choked with smoke and sweat. It was a reminder that even in a culture famous for its emphasis on ritual cleansing, practical sanitation was left to rot. What made the situation worse was the lack of personal hygiene after relieving oneself. Toilet paper did not exist. The options ranged from smooth stones to scraps of cloth, or sometimes nothing at all. In poorer areas, sand itself was used, abrasive and unhygienic. Prostitutes often had no choice but to continue working immediately afterward, carrying the residue of waste back into the trade. Infection of the urinary and reproductive tracts was inevitable. Prepare and preserve instructions for treating such ailments with honey, herbs, and sour milk, but these remedies were more hopeful than effective. The cycle of filth and infection never truly broke. Public latrines did exist in certain towns, but these were communal benches lined over pits, with no partitions for privacy. Sitting shoulder to shoulder with strangers while swatting flies was a normal experience. For prostitutes, using such facilities carried social risk, since their presence was often judged harshly by others, reinforcing the stigma of their trade. Many avoided public latrines entirely, returning instead to the tavern jars and alleys where their own customers relieved themselves. The result was a profession steeped not only in social shame, but in the unavoidable reality of handling waste in the least hygienic ways possible. The smell of waste clung everywhere. Mixed with spoiled beer and rancid fat perfumes, it created an atmosphere that was less seductive than suffocating. Imagine a crowded room where every step risks crushing a beetle fattened on filth, where every breath tastes faintly of rot carried from the street outside. And yet, this was daily life. Prostitutes endured not just the indignities of their work, but the constant assault of sanitation practices that magnified every risk. Diarrheal disease, parasites, and skin infections spread effortlessly, and medical texts show just how frequently healers prescribed treatments for such conditions. The irony lies again in Egypt's obsession with ritual cleanliness. The wealthy bathed in scented water, shaved their bodies, and anointed themselves with expensive oils. Priests purified themselves several times a day before entering temples. Yet prostitutes lived surrounded by human waste, washing only when they could, their bodies treated as vessels of impurity, even as they were sought out nightly. The same society that carved images of lotus flowers and purity rituals on temple walls tolerated streets and brothels that functioned as open sewers. You can feel the grit of sand clinging to damp skin, the sting of flies biting ankles, the sour reek of stale urine rising from nearby jars. Every surface is compromised, every step another brush with waste. Survival in this world was not about finding cleanliness, but enduring its total absence. And as you sit there, the truth of Egyptian hygiene reveals itself. The brothel was not simply a place of intimacy. It was a space where food, filth, and waste blended together into one choking environment, each element feeding the other in an endless loop. The realization settles uncomfortably, but the night has more to reveal. Because beyond the stench of waste and the itch of parasites, there was still the matter of medicine, where every cure for these filthy conditions was just as revolting as the ailments themselves. The jars of waste may be out of sight for now, but the body always carried the consequences. Illness was constant, and for prostitutes in ancient Egypt, the cures were often as revolting as the diseases themselves. Medical papyri, like the famous Ebers papyrus, reveal a world where honey, herbs, and animal products were blended into pastes, ointments, and drinks designed to treat everything from sores to infections. The problem was that very few of these cures had any real effectiveness. Instead, they layered another dimension of filth onto already unhealthy bodies. Honey was the most common ingredient, prized for its antibacterial qualities, long before anyone understood bacteria. It was mixed with grease, milk, or resin, and applied to open wounds. In theory, this might have offered some protection, but in a brothel environment, honey attracted flies instantly. Prostitutes who smeared these treatments onto their skin became walking feasts for insects. Imagine sitting in a stifling tavern, while flies clustered around sticky sores covered in half-dried honey, the buzzing louder than the flutes playing in the corner. The sweetness masked the smell of infection, but only temporarily. Sour milk was another favourite cure. It was poured onto inflamed skin or into irritated eyes, believed to reduce swelling and ward off disease. Archaeological evidence shows that milk was used in dozens of remedies, often fermented until it stank. For prostitutes battling venereal disease or chronic infections, this meant dousing already painful areas in curdled liquid, a treatment that burned more than it soothed. Infections rarely healed. Instead, the stench of sour dairy joined the already overwhelming mix of oils, onions, and waste that defined the brothel atmosphere. Then there were the more exotic prescriptions. Crocodile dung, already infamous as a contraceptive, also appeared in medicinal recipes. It was believed to cleanse the body when applied as a poultice. In practice, it introduced more bacteria than it ever removed. Animal fat was another base for remedies, often mixed with herbs or natron and rubbed into wounds. The heat of the Egyptian climate ensured these fats quickly turned rancid, so what was supposed to be a healing balm became another source of infection. Prostitutes were forced to endure these concoctions, their bodies carrying this double burden of disease and cure alike. Some remedies leaned into the bizarre. Ground-up insects were prescribed for certain skin conditions. Lizard parts were included in recipes to drive away evil spirits thought to cause illness. Magic and medicine were inseparable, meaning prostitutes were often treated with both incantations and poultices, the healer chanting while applying a mix of grease, dung, and honey to the body. Illness was not just physical but spiritual, and prostitutes, already marginalized, were considered especially vulnerable to both. The reality of these cures is visible in the skeletal remains archaeologists have studied. Evidence of chronic infections, abscesses, and bone damage show that illnesses were rarely resolved. Treatments delayed symptoms rather than healing them, and many women carried visible scars from repeated outbreaks of disease. The medical papyri are filled with optimism about their remedies, but the archaeological record paints a picture of constant suffering. The brothel was less a place of pleasure than a revolving door of sickness managed with improvised cures. The irony is that Egypt was considered one of the most medically advanced civilizations of the ancient world. Surgeons could stitch wounds, dentists filled cavities, and physicians recorded hundreds of remedies for every imaginable condition. Yet the prostitutes, who lived in environments thick with filth, rarely had access to the best care. Instead, they were treated with tavern cures passed down orally, or with scraps of advice from medical texts that were centuries old by the time they were applied. The gap between elite medicine and tavern reality was immense, and those caught in the middle paid the price. The sensory detail of these treatments is as haunting as the conditions they attempted to cure. Honey sticky on skin, attracting flies that landed and crawled across open sores, milk clotted and sour, dripping down inflamed wounds, dung and fat congealed into foul-smelling balms. Every treatment layered another stench onto the body, another reason for discomfort, another risk of infection. And yet, they were applied daily, because the alternative was no treatment at all. The connection between superstition and medicine also shaped the experience. Many cures were designed not just to heal the body, but to expel demons or balance unseen forces. Prostitutes became patients in a medical system that saw their suffering as punishment, their illnesses as proof of impurity. Amulets were prescribed alongside ointments, spells whispered as honey was applied. The belief in unseen causes meant that cures were often more about ritual than about effectiveness, prolonging the misery rather than resolving it. You can feel the weight of this cycle pressing down. Every infection met with a cure that invited new pests, every outbreak of disease treated with remedies that added another stench to the room. The brothel becomes a pharmacy of horrors, its women carrying on their bodies the evidence of a medical system both ingenious and ignorant. Egypt's obsession with ritual purity did not extend here. Instead, the cures themselves became part of the filth, each one a reminder that survival was less about healing than about enduring. And as the lamps flicker low, you realise the medical misery was only one part of the picture. The body still had to contend with cosmetics and adornments that poisoned slowly from the outside, while every cure worked its way in from the inside. The body might have been smeared with honey and dung in the name of healing, but the face told its own tragic story. Cosmetics were essential for Egyptian prostitutes, and while they promised allure under flickering lamplight, they often carried poison in every brushstroke. Kohl, the black powder famously painted around Egyptian eyes, was ground from galena, a mineral heavy with lead. Day after day, women traced thick lines along their lids, believing it protected them from disease and the glare of the sun. In some ways it did, since galena can deter certain bacterial infections. But long-term use introduced lead into the body, weakening health slowly but surely. Seduction here was painted in black powder that doubled as a slow-working toxin. The belief in protective cosmetics shaped every aspect of their use. Prostitutes relied on Kohl not only for beauty but for survival, convincing themselves it warded off the illnesses lurking in their trade. Archaeological finds show entire pallets, mixing sticks, and storage jars devoted to cosmetics, suggesting they were used constantly. Mixed with grease or honey, Kohl became a sticky paste that dripped when the heat rose. The lamps in taverns smoked heavily, filling the air with soot. Sweat and soot mingled with the coal, streaking faces into masks of melted black lines that blurred more than they enhanced. Beauty here was fragile, lasting only until the room became too hot. Eye paints were not limited to coal. Malachite, a green copper mineral, was ground and applied for its supposed protective powers. Copper too has antibacterial qualities, but again, prolonged exposure carried risks. The bright green powders were alluring, but they could inflame the eyes, especially in a smoky tavern. Prostitutes layered these powders heavily, their faces glowing green and black, not with health, but with the residue of minerals mined from the desert. Customers may have been drawn to the exotic appearance, but the reality was irritation, blurred vision, and long-term damage. Lip and cheek colour came from ochre mixed with fat, producing a reddish tint. the fat quickly turned rancid, especially in the heat, leaving a stench that mingled with every kiss. Beetle shells were also crushed for pigment, their shimmering powder mixed into balms. Each application added another layer of grease, another invitation for flies to gather. Cosmetics were not sealed in sterile jars, but kept in open containers where dust and insects settled freely. Applying them was less about painting a fresh face than about layering old grease with new powder, all of it clinging to skin already raw from the Nile sun. The deeper problem lay in the way cosmetics interacted with sweat. Prostitutes lived in crowded, overheated taverns where sweat poured constantly, coal mixed with tears and sweat, running down cheeks in dark rivulets. Green powders streaked into muddy stains, lip colour smeared into cracks, leaving residue on clay cups and greasy linen. Every gesture left a trace, turning the art of beauty into a messy process that never held up under real conditions. Archaeologists find cosmetic containers caked with hardened residue, the same sticky mixture that once coated faces night after night. Despite the mess, cosmetics were considered essential. To appear without them was to appear unclean, unappealing, even vulnerable to disease. So prostitutes continued painting, even as their skin broke out in rashes from the constant application. Lead seeped into bloodstreams, copper inflamed eyes, ochre fat spoiled, beetle powders attracted pests. The painted faces promised allure, but beneath the layers they revealed suffering. In a society that idolized appearance, the cost of beauty was slow poisoning. The sensory detail is vivid. Imagine leaning in close and seeing black rivulets running from eyes, green smears glowing faintly in the lamplight, lips painted with rancid fat. The smell is equal parts resin, sweat, and spoiled grease. The touch leaves residue on fingers, a greasy film that clings long after contact. Beauty here is not a mask of perfection, but a melting collage of minerals and oils sliding across skin. The contradiction of Egypt's obsession with cleanliness is sharper than ever. Cosmetics meant to protect from illness were slowly corroding the very bodies they adorned. And yet, cosmetics were not limited to the face. Perfumed cones of fat were placed on wigs and heads, designed to melt slowly, releasing fragrance throughout the evening. Prostitutes wore these cones too, but the cheaper versions were made from rancid animal fat rather than fine oils. As the fat melted, it dripped down hair and neck, leaving greasy trails that smelled more of decay than perfume. To customers, this may have signalled festivity, but to the women enduring it, it was another layer of filth they could never wash away fully. Cosmetics were also tied to superstition. Certain pigments were thought to invoke divine protection, especially powders associated with the gods Horus or Hathor. Prostitutes painted themselves with the hope that beauty was not just a lure but a shield against illness and misfortune. Amulets and cosmetics often appeared together in tombs, reinforcing the idea that painting the face was a spiritual act. But in the tavern brothel, this ritual became grotesque. Paint melted, powders blurred, fat turned rancid, and the spiritual shield was nothing more than a disguise for filth. The archaeological evidence makes the reality impossible to ignore. Residues of lead, copper, and ochre are still visible on pallets thousands of years later. Scientific studies of these residues confirm the presence of toxic compounds. The women who wore them nightly absorbed these substances into their skin and blood, enduring slow poisoning disguised as protection. The cosmetics may have warded off some bacterial infections, but they introduced new dangers that weakened the body over years. The image of a prostitute in an Egyptian brothel is therefore not one of painted beauty but of painted misery. The black coal dripping into lines of sweat, the green powders staining inflamed eyes, the red ochre smearing into cracks of dried lips. Beauty was never permanent, only an illusion painted briefly onto skin before melting away under heat and smoke. Behind the illusion was a body weakened by toxins, rashes, and infection, all while surrounded by the filth of taverns and the stench of rancid oils. You can feel the weight of the cosmetics on your own skin. The grease clogs pores, the powders itch, the lead seeps in quietly. Every blink burns, every bead of sweat carries pigment downward. Beauty here is heavy, suffocating, toxic. And just as the body begins to collapse under these routines, another layer of filth comes from the jewellery and adornments, where copper, bronze and faience leached their own poisons onto already suffering skin. The cosmetics might already be melting into greasy rivers across painted faces, but the jewellery clinging to bodies in these taverns added its own layer of discomfort. Egyptians adored ornaments. Prostitutes wore strings of beads, copper bracelets, faience amulets, and cheap knockoffs of the gold and turquoise treasures flaunted by the wealthy. The purpose was simple: to mimic the refinement of high-born women while luring customers in. But the reality was that these adornments rarely glistened in lamplight the way the tomb paintings suggest. Instead, they turned the skin green, corroded under sweat, and reeked faintly of metal and mould. Copper was the most common metal used, and it reacts quickly with moisture. Sweat made the bracelets and anklets corrode, leaving stains that turned skin a patchy green-black. Archaeological studies show heavy copper residues on excavated jewellery, proving that tarnish was inevitable. Imagine clasping a wrist decorated with gleaming beads, only to feel the stickiness of corrosion, a faint taste of metal lingering in the air. Beauty in this context was temporary, quickly eroded by heat and contact. Bronze, too, was popular, and while stronger than copper, it carried its own problems. Constant friction wore grooves into the skin, which then became infected in environments where hygiene was minimal. The papyri record treatments for abscesses and inflamed skin, often prescribing honey or resin. But these infections were not isolated incidents. Jewellery rubbed against greasy skin coated in rancid oils, trapping filth beneath clasps and beads. Instead of enhancing allure, the adornments became tiny incubators of grime. Beads made of faience, a glazed ceramic material, offered colour without the cost of gemstones. Prostitutes often strung them into elaborate collars or girdles to imitate wealth. But faience was porous, absorbing sweat and oil. Over time, the beads became dull, sticky and foul-smelling, clinging to the body like dirty sponges. Archaeologists find faience beads worn smooth from constant use, their once bright glaze eaten away. For the women who wore them, these necklaces were less about glamour and more about carrying yet another layer of unhygienic material against already suffering skin. Even amulets, supposedly protective, offered no relief. Small carvings of gods or sacred animals were worn on cords or woven into beadwork. Hathor, goddess of love, was a favourite motif, her face carved onto pendants. But amulets pressed into greasy flesh accumulated grime like everything else. The cords, often made of linen or leather, absorbed sweat until they stiffened, rubbing sores into necks and shoulders. What was supposed to bring divine protection instead brought rashes, swelling and more filth. The gods may have been invoked, but the insects buzzing around greasy cords remained unimpressed. Adornment extended beyond the body. Prostitutes decorated their hairpieces and wigs with beads, pins and small metal ornaments. These too carried grime, as oils and resins melted down, coating everything in sticky residue. Archaeological depictions of dancers and prostitutes show them adorned with collars and anklets, yet the real versions would have been heavy, smelly and perpetually filthy. Imagine strands of beads dragging through greasy wig hair already alive with lice. Jewellery promised allure, but in the dim heat of the tavern it promised only more discomfort. The archaeological record reinforces this contradiction. Excavations of taverns and domestic spaces uncover heaps of broken beads, corroded bracelets, and faience shards, often discarded when they became too filthy or broken to use. But for prostitutes, adornment was essential to maintain an illusion of appeal. Without it, they risked appearing too plain to attract customers. With it, they endured the constant misery of infection, stains, and foul odours. There was no clean solution, only the endless cycle of filth disguised as beauty. The sensory impact is easy to reconstruct. The metallic tang of corroded copper clings to the air, mixing with yeast, onions, and animal fat perfumes. Necklaces grow sticky against sweat. Bracelets rub raw skin. Anklets clink with grime as feet shuffle across reed mats. The weight of adornment presses constantly, leaving marks on the skin that itch and sting. Beauty is heavy here, and every ornament tells the story of discomfort rather than allure. Egypt's obsession with adornment was tied deeply to its religion and culture. Jewellery was thought to protect, to empower, to connect the wearer with divine forces. Prostitutes adopted the same symbols, hoping to shield themselves from disease, misfortune, and judgment. But the gods carved in faience could not ward off lice, tarnish, or infections. The jewellery became one more layer of contradiction, a spiritual promise mired in physical misery. The divine was invoked in every bead, but the reality was green-stained skin and festering sores. The irony sharpens when you recall how the wealthy treated their jewellery. Gold and precious stones were polished, stored carefully, and placed in tombs to last eternity. Prostitutes wore imitations that corroded in days, beads that smelled foul within weeks, cords that rotted against damp flesh. The contrast between tomb art and tavern life could not be greater. One preserved perfection forever, the other dissolved into filth nightly. You can feel the metal sticking to your wrist, the beads tugging at your neck, the cords chafing under sweat. The green stains seep deeper into the skin, the smell grows sharper, and every movement reminds you that adornment here is not luxury but burden. And just when you think the body cannot bear another layer of discomfort, there is still the matter of what lies at the feet, where the floors of these brothels revealed their own revolting truths about hygiene and survival. The ornaments may have turned the body into a jangling mess of green stains and infections, but the real stage for filth was the floor itself. Every step inside a tavern brothel carried the crunch of discarded fish bones, the stick of spilled beer, and the slick smear of oils dripping from bodies and lamps alike. Floors were not cleaned daily. They were mats of reeds or bare-packed earth, sometimes covered with rushes or straw. These coverings soaked up every liquid, from sweat to urine to spilled wine, and once saturated, they were simply left to rot in place. Reed mats are still found in excavations, their fibres darkened with centuries of grime. Imagine what they looked like in their time of use. Every encounter in the brothel left a trace. Oils dripping, drinks spilling, crumbs falling, sweat pooling. Within days, the mats turned into rancid sponges, alive with insects that thrived in the damp. Fleas and lice bred in the fibres. Cockroaches scuttled between cracks. The simple act of walking barefoot across the floor meant joining an ecosystem of pests that never truly left. In wealthier homes, servants replaced mats regularly, but in taverns and brothels, the same reed mat might lie for weeks or months before being swapped out. By then it reeked of mildew, coated with sticky layers that clung to the skin. Prostitutes spent hours sitting, kneeling, or lying on these mats, their skin pressed against filth that bred rashes and sores. When archaeologists find traces of parasites in ancient remains, these floors were part of the story. The ground itself was an incubator of disease. The heat of the Egyptian climate only made things worse. Moisture from spilled drinks and bodily fluids did not dry cleanly, but baked into the fibres, releasing odours whenever the mat was disturbed. Step on a patch of straw and a wave of mildew and rot rose instantly. The tavern floor was a constant source of smell, one that mixed with perfumes, cosmetics, and spoiled food, until the entire room became suffocating. Seduction might happen here, but it was carried out over carpets of rot, with every movement releasing a new wave of stench. Earthen floors were no safer. Packed dirt absorbed waste like a sponge. Chamber pots dumped into alleys quickly drained back into living spaces, leaving the ground damp with contaminants. The Nile's flooding added another dimension, seeping into taverns and leaving behind silt rich with worms and larvae. Prostitutes working barefoot or in sandals pressed their skin against these surfaces nightly, their bodies absorbing every hazard of the floor. Infections of the feet and legs were inevitable, as scratches and sores open pathways for bacteria. The archaeological record tells the same story. Layers of compacted earth in excavated taverns reveal not only pottery shards and fish bones, but traces of human and animal waste. The floor was not just a surface, but a landfill of daily life. Prostitutes endured this constantly, their living and working spaces merging into the same filthy environment. A floor was never simply a floor. It was a record of everything spilled, excreted, or dropped across it, all pressed together into a surface they could not escape. Furniture offered little relief. Benches were hard, slick with oils, and rarely covered. Mats thrown over them absorbed just as much filth as the floors. Prostitutes sat in garments already greasy with sweat, their skin pressed against mats that clung to every movement. The result was a constant itch, rashes that spread, and sores that festered. Medical papyri describe boils and inflamed skin as common complaints, and the floors of taverns help explain why. The smell, more than anything, defined these spaces. Every step stirred up dust thick with waste. Every shuffle released the odour of mildew. Every overturned jar added another layer of stink. Imagine lying down after a night's work, the mat damp beneath you, the floor alive with insects, the air tasting faintly of mould. The illusion of painted murals showing dancers on clean floors collapses instantly when compared to the reality of brothel life, where the very ground was your enemy. Religious contradictions sharpen here too. Temples demanded purification before stepping inside, with priests washing several times a day and floors kept clean through ritual sweeping. Yet prostitutes lived their entire lives on surfaces crawling with filth. To them the floor was not sacred space but a hazard to be endured. Every movement was a negotiation with dirt, every encounter carried out on mats that trapped filth as surely as any jar or pit. The contrast between ritual purity and lived squalor could not be more striking. You can feel the grit under your toes, the dampness of straw clinging to your skin, the bite of insects scuttling between cracks. The air rises heavy with mildew, every breath tasting of earth and rot. The body cannot escape the floor because it is everywhere beneath you, pressing its contamination into every contact. Beauty painted on the face and jewellery strung around the body mattered little, when the foundation beneath it all was saturated with filth. And as your eyes adjust to the dim lamplight, you realise that the floor was only one surface of misery. The walls themselves carried another story of grime, soot, and infestation, pressing filth into every inch of the brothel space. The ground may have been alive with insects and damp straw, but the misery rose upward. The walls and ceilings of these tavern brothels carried their own record of filth, every inch stained with smoke, grease, and years of neglect. Most buildings were made of mud brick plastered with clay, porous enough to absorb every smell and every spill. Unlike the cool stone walls of temples or palaces, tavern walls breathed with the filth of the bodies pressed against them. Sweat, oils, and smoke left black streaks across the clay. Over time, the walls themselves became part of the stench, releasing their odours each time the heat of the day baked them. Oil lamps were the greatest culprit. They burned on every bench and corner, fueled by thick animal fat or cheap castor oil. Their flames smoked heavily, leaving soot that climbed upward in greasy trails. Ceilings blackened quickly, cobwebs trapped the soot, and insects nested inside. Archaeologists still find soot deposits clinging to ancient ceilings, proof of centuries of smoky air. For prostitutes, this meant breathing a haze of grease and ash every night, their lungs carrying the residue of every flickering lamp. The air was never clear, always heavy, always choking. Ventilation was poor. Windows were rare, and taverns relied on small slits cut into the walls or open doorways. In the crowded nights, the heat grew unbearable. Bodies pressed together, lamps smoked constantly, and without proper ventilation the air turned thick and stifling. Imagine the mix of rancid perfumes, spoiled beer, rotting food and sweat, all trapped inside a clay box with no escape. Each breath carried the taste of grease and mildew. By morning the air was so heavy that walking outside felt like surfacing from underwater. Walls absorbed more than just smoke. They absorbed the touch of greasy hands, the impact of spilled drinks, the splash of chamber pots tossed too carelessly. Every surface bore stains, layered year after year until the original plaster disappeared beneath grime. Archaeological analysis of ancient walls has revealed chemical traces of organic matter embedded into the clay. That polite phrase translates to human waste, animal residue, and endless layers of organic rot. The walls of these spaces were not clean surfaces. They were storage containers of filth. Even the decorations carried filth. Prostitutes sometimes hung beads or cloth along the walls, imitations of the fine wall hangings found in wealthier homes. But cloth absorbed smoke and oils instantly. Within weeks it smelled worse than the mats on the floor. Beads collected soot and grime, their colours fading beneath layers of black. Decorations promised refinement, but in practice they turned into filth traps dangling in the smoky haze. What was supposed to suggest luxury only magnified the misery. Insects thrived in these walls. Mud brick cracks offered perfect hiding places for cockroaches and beetles. Fleas bred in the straw stuffed into gaps for insulation. Termites gnawed through the wooden beams overhead, showering dust onto those below. Archaeological digs frequently find remains of pests preserved in ancient plaster. For prostitutes, the walls were never simply walls. They were alive, buzzing, crawling, dropping filth from above. Any attempt to rest beneath them meant sharing space with colonies of pests entrenched for generations. The ceilings added another layer of discomfort. Made of wooden beams covered with reed mats and mud plaster, they sagged under years of smoke and heat. Bits of plaster crumbled onto the floor with every shift in temperature. Insects nested above, their droppings falling constantly. Spiders spun webs thick with soot, dangling above the reed mats where people lay. The ceiling was not protection. It was another source of filth raining down steadily, a constant reminder that even overhead surfaces contributed to the misery. The combination of poor ventilation, constant smoke, and rotting walls left the air inside brothels as dangerous as the floors beneath. Respiratory disease was common in ancient Egypt, with skeletal remains showing damage to sinuses and lungs consistent with long-term exposure to smoke and dust. Prostitutes endured this daily, breathing in soot-filled air that scarred their lungs, while their bodies pressed against greasy mats and pest-filled walls. The brothel was not just unhygienic on the surface, it poisoned from every angle, inside and out. Religious contradictions surface again here. Temples were swept clean constantly, their walls washed, their air purified with incense. Even the homes of the wealthy burned imported resins to scent the air. Brothels instead burned cheap animal fat in lamps, coating their walls in soot and their lungs in filth. Prostitutes lived and worked in spaces that inverted the Egyptian obsession with cleanliness, replacing incense with grease smoke, polished stone with mud-stained plaster, sacred murals with insect nests. You can feel the heaviness of the air as you breathe, your lungs filling with grease and ash. Your hand presses against the wall and comes away sticky, the clay damp with sweat and stains. Above, a flake of plaster falls onto your shoulder, carrying soot and insect droppings. Every surface presses in, every breath tastes stale. beauty painted onto the body dissolves quickly when the entire space is saturated with grime. The brothel is not a building you walk into. It is a suffocating box of filth that seeps into you until it feels like a second skin. And as your eyes wander upward into the haze, you realise that the body did not only suffer from its surroundings. The very breath that sustained life was shared constantly, a mixture of smoke, sweat, and disease, where illness drifted invisibly from one body to another in the stale, heavy air. The walls may have trapped smoke and grease, but the real danger was invisible, hanging heavy in the air with every breath. Taverns that doubled as brothels were breeding grounds for contagion, where diseases spread not just through touch, but through the very act of breathing in the same stifling haze. Archaeological and medical evidence paints a grim picture of ancient Egypt's battles with respiratory illness, venereal disease, and chronic infections, all magnified in the cramped, unventilated rooms where prostitutes worked. Lung disease was a constant threat. Soot from oil lamps filled every corner, coating lungs with residue. Studies of ancient Egyptian mummies showed damage to respiratory tracts, consistent with long-term exposure to smoke. Prostitutes endured this nightly, their lungs scarred as much by the tavern air as by the labour of their trade. Add to this the constant presence of crowds, each coughing into the stale room, and infection spread quickly. Tuberculosis has been detected in Egyptian remains, suggesting that coughing in close quarters was as deadly as any knife fight in an alley. Sexually transmitted infections were another constant presence. The Ebers Papyrus, a medical text from around 1550 BCE, includes recipes for treating genital sores, discharges, and inflammations. Treatments often involved honey, sour milk, or ground minerals applied directly to the body. The frequency of such remedies tells us these infections were common. In brothels, where clients came and went in steady waves, the diseases spread without interruption. Prostitutes carried the burden of chronic infection, their bodies weakened by repeated outbreaks, and the ineffective treatments that followed. Skin diseases also thrived in this environment. Fungal infections passed from mats, lice carried fevers, and mites burrowed into skin. Archaeologists have found lice combs in abundance, showing how constant the battle was. But in taverns, the fight was never won. Close contact, sweaty surfaces, and filthy bedding ensured parasites moved freely from one body to another. Itching was not an occasional inconvenience. It was a daily reality that left scratches, sores, and further avenues for infection. Even the act of sharing cups and food spread illness. Clay vessels were rarely washed properly. Spit clung to rims, spreading colds and gastrointestinal diseases. Dysentery was common, fueled by contaminated food and water, and once it began, it swept through communities quickly. Prostitutes working in taverns were trapped in the middle of this cycle, forced to eat and drink in the same spaces where waste and disease circulated. Their bodies became vessels of contagion, weakened by malnutrition and exhaustion. The stench itself hinted at danger. Ancient Egyptians understood that foul smells were connected to sickness. Though they lacked the concept of bacteria, they believed disease spread through bad air, which they called miasma. In brothels, the air was thick with every foul odour imaginable, and while they may not have known the true cause, their instincts were not entirely wrong. The concentration of filth, sweat, and smoke ensured that every breath carried risk. Prostitutes lived daily inside this invisible storm, inhaling danger with every gasp. The irony lies in Egypt's medical reputation. Physicians in the courts of pharaohs practiced surgery, dentistry, and advanced treatments for wounds. The wealthy had access to remedies prepared under controlled conditions. Prostitutes, however, endured tavern cures administered with little hygiene, surrounded by an atmosphere that undermined every attempt at healing. No amount of honey or resin could cure a lung scarred by smoke or a body exhausted by parasites. The very air they breathed ensured constant suffering. The sensory overload is impossible to ignore. Imagine sitting shoulder to shoulder with strangers in a room lit by smoking lamps, the air heavy with sweat and perfumes, while coughing echoes from every corner. The heat presses down, the air refuses to move, and your chest tightens with every inhale. A brush of skin carries lice, a shared cup carries dysentery, a cough carries tuberculosis. The brothel is not simply a place of business. It is an incubator of disease, a furnace where infection is stoked nightly. Religious contradictions appear yet again. Temples were fumigated with incense to purify the air, a symbolic act of cleansing that also reduced odours. Brothels, in contrast, burned fat that fouled the air further. The gods were called upon to protect the body, but inside these taverns no divine force stopped the spread of sickness. Prostitutes were left to their own endurance, their lives shortened not just by their trade, but by the constant assault of invisible enemies filling their lungs and blood. You can feel the ache in your chest, the scratch of soot on your throat, the burn in your eyes as the smoke thickens. The itch of lice creeps across your scalp, the sweat of strangers presses against your skin, and the sound of coughing rattles endlessly in your ears. Every breath is shared, every sickness communal, every moment a gamble with unseen dangers. The air is not neutral, it is alive with contagion, pressing into you until survival feels like a matter of luck. And as you sit in this haze of smoke and disease, you realise the body's suffering was not confined to illness alone. The very act of grooming, of shaving and hair removal, introduced another set of unhygienic practices that added still more misery to the lives of Egyptian prostitutes. The air may have been alive with disease, but the body itself demanded constant grooming. Egyptian culture placed enormous importance on hair removal, and prostitutes were expected to meet these ideals even in the filth of taverns. Smooth skin was considered clean, a sign of refinement, and so every patch of hair was shaved, plucked or scorched away. The irony is that this pursuit of cleanliness often created as much filth and discomfort as it removed. Razors were crude blades of bronze or copper, sharpened enough to scrape hair from the body but not precise enough to avoid injury. Archaeologists have uncovered razors in abundance, many worn smooth from repeated use. Prostitutes wielded these tools constantly, dragging metal against sweaty, oily skin already prone to rashes. Cuts and nicks were unavoidable, each one an open invitation for infection in a world filled with parasites and dirt. The belief that shaving created purity only ensured that sores and boils multiplied faster. Depilation was not limited to razors. Mixtures of resin, wax and even burnt shells were smeared onto the skin to tear hair out by the roots. These ancient waxes clung fiercely, pulling away hair and skin alike. Imagine sitting in a smoky tavern, your body already coated in grease and coal, while hot resin is pressed onto your flesh and ripped away, leaving patches of raw skin exposed to sweat and grime. Grooming was not a luxury here. It was pain endured nightly, repeated until the skin itself grew scarred and inflamed. Plucking was another common method, using small bronze tweezers to rip hair one by one. Prostitutes often plucked eyebrows into thin lines, imitating the style seen in murals of noblewomen. But in a tavern setting, the plucked skin quickly became red and swollen, dust and oils clogging the open pores. Infections bloomed where beauty was supposed to flourish. Eyebrows may have looked sleek in the dim lamplight, but they came at the price of constant irritation. Shaving the head was common in Egypt, both to combat lice and to keep the scalp smooth for wigs. Prostitutes followed the same practice, but the results were less hygienic than intended. Bronze razors left cuts across the scalp, which in the sweaty, smoky environment of taverns often became infected. Without clean bandages, these cuts festered, producing scabs that clung beneath wigs. The wigs themselves, already crawling with lice and soaked in oils, pressed against these wounds, worsening the infections. Smoothness was the goal, but misery was the result. Depilation of the body was especially harsh. Mixtures of natron and vinegar were rubbed onto hair to weaken it before scraping it away. Natron, the same substance used in mummification, dried the skin until it cracked. Prostitutes endured this process repeatedly, their bodies becoming test subjects for chemical burns disguised as beauty treatments. Smoothness might have been achieved briefly, but beneath the surface the skin was dry, irritated, and vulnerable. The religious justification for hair removal made it unavoidable. Clean-shaven bodies were associated with ritual purity, a state demanded of priests and temple attendants. Prostitutes, despite their marginal status, mimicked these ideals to appear more appealing. To present hair was to present impurity, so grooming became a requirement. Yet while priests washed in sacred pools and applied balms prepared by servants, prostitutes shaved with blunt razors in filthy corners, applying rancid oils afterward to soothe their wounds. Cleanliness was defined by the same cultural standard, but the reality of its practice could not have been more different. Archaeological finds provide glimpses into these routines. Razors, tweezers, and small grooming kits appear frequently in domestic digs, proving how widespread the practice was. Medical papyri mention treatments for inflamed skin and sores, often prescribing honey or resin to soothe the damage. These texts show that the consequences of grooming were known, but the practice never stopped. Beauty and cleanliness carried too much cultural weight to be abandoned, no matter the cost to the skin. The sensory experience of grooming is easy to imagine. The metallic scrape of bronze against skin, the sting of cuts opening, the pull of tweezers tearing hair, the burn of resin ripping patches clean. Sweat drips into open wounds, smoke settles into irritated pores, and flies gather instantly. The pain is sharp, the smell of burnt resin lingers, and the promise of smoothness never outweighs the misery. Every session of grooming only added to the layers of filth clinging to the body. The irony deepens when you compare this to the wealthy. Noble women were groomed by servants who applied oils, perfumes, and balms after depilation. Prostitutes had no such luxury. Their grooming was self-inflicted or done hastily in taverns, with oils that spoiled and perfumes that stank. Smoothness was achieved, but comfort never was. Beauty here was a constant cycle of cutting, burning, plucking, and enduring, all for the illusion of refinement that crumbled as soon as sweat returned. You can feel the sting of cuts across your skin, the irritation of pores swollen from plucking, the dryness of natron cracking your flesh. The wig presses down, hiding sores, the oils drip into wounds, the air stings with smoke. Grooming does not cleanse, it corrupts, turning the pursuit of smoothness into yet another avenue of infection. And as the body suffers under blades and resins, the mouth reveals its own set of grotesque routines, where attempts at fresh breath carried flavours straight from the tomb. The razors may have left skin raw, but the mouth was another battlefield of filth. Egyptian culture valued fresh breath as a mark of refinement, yet the methods of achieving it were more suited for embalming the dead than enticing the living. Prostitutes chewed on natron, the very same mineral used to desiccate corpses, believing it purified the mouth. In theory, natron scoured teeth and neutralized odors. In practice, it dried the tongue, cracked the lips, and left every kiss tasting faintly of desert sand and funeral rites. Chewing natron was only the beginning. Recipes preserved in medical papyri describe mouthwashes made of herbs, frankincense, and sometimes even donkey milk. These mixtures were swished around to mask the smell of onions, beer, and sweat. But without proper understanding of bacteria or dental health, they did little beyond layering another strange taste onto already foul breath. Imagine leaning close to someone who has just rinsed with sour milk and frankincense resin. The smell sharp and cloying, hiding nothing. Intimacy became less about attraction and more about endurance. Toothpaste existed in Egypt, though it was less a paste than a grinding powder. Archaeologists have uncovered recipes involving crushed pumice, powdered ox hooves, and ashes. Prostitutes may have used such concoctions when they could afford them, scraping away plaque with substances that shredded enamel. The The result was a mouth free of visible build-up but filled with bleeding gums and cracked teeth. Freshness was achieved through abrasion, each smile hiding the pain of eroded mouths. Teeth were rarely healthy to begin with. The Egyptian diet was filled with grit, sand blown into bread during grinding. Over years, this wore teeth down to stubs, exposing roots and nerves. Prostitutes, who lived on the cheapest bread and drank the grittiest beer, suffered especially. Archaeological studies of mummies revealed jaws riddled with abscesses, infections that swelled painfully and spread bacteria into the bloodstream. No amount of natron chewing could disguise the rot of infected gums. The breath of many prostitutes carried not only the smell of onions and beer, but the unmistakable sourness of decay. Perfumes were sometimes used as a last resort. Drops of resin or myrrh were placed directly on the tongue, burning sharply, but masking odours briefly. These resins were expensive, however, so prostitutes often relied on cheaper substitutes like local herbs or even animal fat rubbed along the gums. The fat quickly spoiled, turning rancid, and any illusion of freshness dissolved into a stench worse than the one it tried to cover. The irony of using decay to disguise decay was not lost on those forced to endure it. Oral health had spiritual dimensions too. Bad breath was considered a sign of impurity, sometimes linked to demonic influence. Spells and amulets were prescribed to drive away the spirits thought to cause toothaches. Prostitutes, already stigmatized, carried the burden of this superstition as well. A swollen jaw was not just painful, but socially damning, marking them as touched by impurity in a trade that demanded at least the appearance of allure. The stigma added another weight to bodies already struggling under layers of filth and disease. The sensory experience of these mouth rituals is vivid. Natron crunching between teeth, leaving grit against the tongue. Sour milk burning the throat as it is swished. Resin clinging to gums, its taste sharp and bitter. Bleeding gums add iron to the mix, while abscesses release a foul tang that no herb can mask. The act of freshening the mouth becomes another ordeal, layering tastes and smells until intimacy is less a kiss, and more a chemical experiment gone wrong. Archaeological evidence supports the misery. Studies of dental remains from prostitutes' quarters in ancient settlements show severe wear, abscesses, and infections far beyond the average. Their diets and constant exposure to grit accelerated decay, and their remedies worsened the damage. The papyri preserve endless recipes for tooth powders, rinses and spells, but the skeletons confirm the truth. The mouth was rarely clean, never painless, and always another source of stench. The irony deepens when compared to the wealthy. Nobles were buried with toothpicks of ivory and gold, their mouths adorned with signs of care. Prostitutes scraped their teeth with twigs, smeared rancid oils, and prayed that natron could mask the stench of onions and beer. The illusion of refinement painted in murals collapses instantly under the reality of cracked teeth, bleeding gums and breath steeped in sour milk. Beauty may have been painted on the face, but the mouth betrayed everything. You can taste it yourself in this imagined haze. The dryness of natron, the sharp bite of resin, the sourness of milk curdling on the tongue. Every word spoken carries the scent of decay. Every breath shared with a client becomes another challenge to endure. The mouth, meant to entice, becomes another weapon of revulsion. And as you recoil from this imagined taste, you realize that oral misery was only one part of the burden. The feet, too, told their own story, pressed bare against filth, carrying parasites and infections with every step. The mouth may have been a battlefield of grit and sour milk, but the misery only deepened when you looked downward. Feet carried the full burden of brothel life, pressed constantly against floors alive with filth, insects, and disease. In a land where sandals were optional and bare feet common, prostitutes endured an environment where every step risked infection. Sandals, when worn, were little more than flat soles of leather or woven reeds, flimsy barriers against the dirt and waste beneath. They offered no real protection, and often rubbed blisters that quickly turned septic in the heat. Archaeologists have found countless sandals in Egyptian settlements, many patched repeatedly until they fell apart. Prostitutes wore theirs thin, if they had them at all, shuffling barefoot across mats soaked with beer, oils and worse. Cuts and scratches from reed mats or broken pottery shards opened constantly. These wounds rarely healed properly, since feet were pressed back into filth daily. Medical papyri preserve remedies for abscesses and ulcers on the feet, often involving honey or poultices of grease and herbs. But the persistence of such treatments tells us these ailments were not occasional. They were chronic. Parasites thrived in this environment. Fleas and lice bit ankles, spreading fevers. Hookworms entered through bare skin, their larvae living in soil contaminated with human waste. Schistosomiasis, a disease carried by parasites in the Nile's waters, burrowed into bodies through bare feet during floods or baths. Prostitutes lived at the epicenter of these risks, their daily contact with floors and streets ensuring constant exposure. Each step was not just movement, it was another opportunity for a parasite to enter, another avenue for disease to flourish. The condition of the feet reflected the broader contradictions of Egyptian life. Temples depicted elegant women in clean sandals, standing on polished floors. Prostitutes stood on reed mats alive with fleas, their skin cracked and swollen. Infection warped toenails, corns grew thick, and fungal diseases spread unchecked. Archaeological studies of Egyptian remains show bone damage and lesions consistent with chronic infection of the feet, a silent record of lives lived in constant contact with contaminated ground. The sensory details make the misery clear. Imagine stepping onto damp straw, the smell of mildew rising instantly. Insects crawl across your toes, biting and itching, while the grit of sand grinds into cracks in your skin. Sweat mixes with dirt, creating a paste that never truly washes away. Sandals rub until blisters burst, leaving sores raw and open. Each step across the brothel floor is less a stride and more an act of endurance. Religious and social attitudes added another layer of discomfort. Feet were considered unclean in Egyptian culture, the lowest part of the body both physically and symbolically. Prostitutes, whose entire bodies were already stigmatized, carried this burden even more. Their feet bore not just physical pain but social scorn, seen as extensions of impurity. This stigma ensured that little attention was given to their suffering, even as infections spread and parasites flourished. Archaeological evidence from workers' villages near tombs reveals that labourers and prostitutes alike often shared similar conditions. Sandals unearthed there show heavy wear, patched with fibre and leather scraps. Yet for prostitutes, the constant exposure to tavern floors and customers' waste made their situation uniquely harsh. They carried infections upward into their bodies, their feet swelling, their legs aching, their strength draining slowly. The foundation of their survival was crumbling beneath them. The irony grows sharper when compared to the wealthy. Noble women wore sandals of fine leather, their feet washed in perfumed water, anointed with oils, and pampered by servants. Prostitutes scrubbed their cracked heels with natron, or rubbed rancid fat into blisters, hoping to soothe pain while only worsening the smell. Their feet were never symbols of refinement, only testaments to endurance in an environment designed to erode them. And drop a comment below and let me know which piece of historical suffering you'd like me to unravel next. Maybe it's more medieval filth, maybe it's Victorian awkwardness, maybe it's something even worse that I haven't dared to touch yet. And if you actually enjoy falling asleep to the sound of humanity's most revolting mistakes, check out my other videos. There's a whole library of misery waiting for you, neatly packaged for bedtime.